All righty. Hello, Ovetta Sampson.
Hi, how are you?
Good evening. I am great. How are you?
I'm doing really good. I could not complain even if I wanted to.
I'm going to be honest with you here. I had half a bag of Funyuns and a can of White Claw for dinner. So peak, peak old millennial going on here.
Dinner of champions, right?
Indeed,
A
indeed.
quarantine special, I think. Right?
Indeed. Welcome back, everyone who's watching to UXR Conversations, where I talk to industry researchers, research managers, research leaders about topics that we care about and hope interest others as well. My name is Noam Segal, and I am Director of User Research at Wealthfront, and currently on parental leave and pandemic leave and whatever. And with me today is the marvelous Ovetta Sampson, Principal Creative Director at Microsoft. Hey.
Hi.
And we are going to talk about, so the short version is, I just called it like data design and research, but in the description, we called this mixing, hold on, mixing design, research and data, using data in your research practices for innovation and exploration. We want to unpack some of the mysteries today of how to use data and data science during the more kind of ambiguous research phases that are typically qual or ethnographically focused.
Yeah.
That sounds great to me. Before we jump into that, though, a couple of things. So I got my PhD from the U of I, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I did my time in Illinois. I know you did too.
Mhm.
So one very important question: where is the best pizza in Chicago? What's your favorite pizza place in Chicago?
I get this question a lot, and there are great local places like Peapod, which people will travel, over an hour to get to because it's way up north, or the kind of like famous like Giovanni's. People know that and they go there. But when I was growing up, my mom would always take me to this small pizza parlor shop called Lena's. And it was on the southwest side of Chicago. It was owned by an Italian family. It was very small. There was only one in the city. And because my mom would take me there, or we would order from there and then pick it up or whatever, it just was like the best pizza ever, because pizza was like a thing. It was like so special to have it, because my mom like never was like, we're never eating out. But when we did eat pizza, it was Lena's. And I still remember how great it tasted, and just to be there with my parents and to eat that pizza and to just enjoy that family outing. So that's always my favorite. Most people have never heard of it. It's just a neighborhood place, but I really enjoy it.
I have not been, but thank you for sharing. One more to add to the list. My favorite, just so you know, if you head back there, hopefully soon, once we can travel, is Spacca Napoli.
Oh, yeah.
In Ravenswood. It's owned by this guy, Jonathan, who volunteered on a kibbutz back in Israel in the 1970s. He imports everything from Italy. It's classic Neapolitan style pizza. It is incredible.
Yeah. That sounds amazing.
Now, I wish we could talk about pizza the whole evening, but we're trying to get to other subjects as well. Can you kind of kick us off with a bit about your journey and going from, at least in academically, from communications, journalism through HCI to what you do today? And I'd love for you to answer that in the context of data and kind of where you've encountered more data practices, data science, and how your relationship with data strengthened throughout your journey. Can you share a bit about that before we jump into some of the other things?
I think my point of view about data and design was developed at a very early age. So it's not a point of view that I think is natural for a lot of ethnographers or people who do design research or user research, because qual research is so heavily embedded in those types of practices. And it's almost kind of like us versus them sometimes when you talk about qual versus quant and all that good stuff. But for me, there was never a dichotomy between the two, because when I was younger, I was I was a mini journalist, I guess, when I was like 9 years old. And I would go around the neighborhood and talk to people and write stories and stuff like that. But then my father was also in night school, and he was learning how to program, and worked in kind of like statistics and code and programming and COBOL and Fortran and all that kind of stuff. And so I learned that as well at 9. And so this idea of like numbers and people were always connected to me. Like I always saw like an action reaction when it came to people and numbers. And then when I became a journalist, I worked for a mentor, and he was this amazing, like older guy who smoked cigarettes and drank whiskey. And he was just a well-known editor in the industry. And he would say to me, like, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source, right? Like totally didn't trust anything that people said. And so he had instilled in me getting 3 sources for every fact, right? And so not always could I talk to 3 different people about the same subject. And that's when I started using data as a source. So when I was a journalist and I was covering things like, I was a police reporter for a very long time, and I was an education reporter. And so those are 2 fields that have a lot of data, especially both criminal justice and education. And so there were things that people would say to me that I would use data as a way to corroborate or to discredit, either way, what they were saying. And so this idea of data being a source, or data being able to tell me a story, was ingrained in me early on in my 20s as a reporter. Because I don't know if you've ever read small town newspapers, but in small town newspapers, they have a section that basically tells you all the crime that happened that night. Like Mrs. Betty's cat was, taken from her living room, or like somebody broke into this car. Well, I was the one person who went to the jail and like typed all that in, right? And so I had to kind of like basically become this like human statistics reporter, right? Like you're writing about all the crime that's happening in a town. And so when the mayor or the district attorney would say, we don't have crime in this town, or whatever blanket statement that they would say, I would be like, hey, wait a minute. I have a list of data that says that's not true. And so data was really a way for me to confirm or deny, right? Like certain things that qualitatively people were saying, where their memory wasn't just quite right, or it wasn't like they were being, what I say, deliberately dishonest. But as people, we like to remember the past in a way that is connected to our emotion and not so much to the accuracy. And so I would report on people. I would do these really deep features on people, and I would use data to kind of like stitch the story together. So if somebody said, oh, this guy, like, I reported on murders and nice guys and all kinds of stuff, and it's like, this guy would never, hurt a fly, right? Then you would go through criminal records or go through records to see, like, does it add up? And so that was something I did as a young reporter that just kind of followed me through my career. And when I got into design, and a lot of reporters who I would say, I think smart, who switch careers into something like tech or design end up as researchers. And if you're a journalist and you end up as a researcher, it's just automatic that you would do ethnography or qual, because you already understand what it is to interview people. And so when I got my HCI degree and I was working with my software development background, or just not afraid of software or coding, I was a web designer as well. So I taught myself a lot of HTML and CSS. I would just automatically use data when I was doing UX research. So I would never just say, hey, you should design this page this way, right? I remember just digging into Google Analytics and just looking at the way people were kind of like utilizing websites and matching what people were saying to what they were doing. And so when I got to IDEO has a famous saying about what people say is not always what they do, right? And that's why when we do design research, we try to match up behavior and perceptions. And I found that data was a really great way. Even data in qual was a really great way to have revelations about why people were doing the things that they were doing, and also have evidence to show that they were actually doing the things. And sometimes mostly like they weren't doing the things that they said that they were doing. It was more like what they wanted to be perceived as. And so I always thought that qual without that underlying data was, I wouldn't say not trustworthy. I would just say it fits in a certain box. And that data matched with behavior, documented behavior matched with motivation, right? Why I'm telling you why, is stronger than each apart. To give you, because research, what is the purpose of research, right? This is what I tell my students. Why do we do design research, right? The purpose is to have confidence in our design. And what allows you to have more confidence in design, if what you find in qual research about why people are doing something is matched with what they actually do. Like that's like the 1-2 punch that's really hard to argue with.
So many things come to me. One of them is that you might have been one of the first kind of data journalists before it became cool.
Yeah, they called it computer assisted reporting back then. So that tells you how old I am. Yeah, we actually had an editor who was a computer assisted reporting editor, and his name was Jim, and we would work together, two nerds, being story detectives and data. Like literally going through reams of criminal justice data and reams of, like I did a story on racial profiling and student expulsions. And it was one thing for the teacher to say, we expel Black kids or kids of color more than we do other kids. But it was another thing to show the data to the district and say, this is undeniable. There's something going on here, right? Like this is not normal.
This marriage, which I would say is a very happy marriage between data and design, what you're describing, it always seems so natural to me, so obvious, and yet it doesn't occur often enough, right?
Yeah.
Did you feel the same way? And if so, why do you think that is? Because when you describe it, it just makes so much sense to me, and yet I don't see it too often. And also, let's keep in mind here, you have this incredible eclectic background, which married kind of the coding and the web design with the reporting and the storytelling and the narrative building and the data. One of the things I wonder is what's harder to do, to become a data-informed storyteller, or to come from the data side, in the modern day, we like a data scientist, and brush up on your storytelling.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because there's a lot of assumptions, and I think a lot of people would assume it's more difficult to come from the storytelling side to the data side. which is why I think it doesn't happen. So in my talk last year at UX Research Collect, the talk I had about marrying design and design research and data, or user research and data, in the innovation and exploration phase, not because it's really easy to see where data comes in the usability phase, right?
Sure.
Because you're doing surveys, you're doing testing, like it makes sense. And that data is more like statistics, right? So you really kind of, nobody has a problem with that. And what I talked about in my talk is like, there's low data literacy, I think. And the reason why, that's not a judgment, it's more like, if you're a storyteller, you may not have taken, unless you're doing usability studies or whatever, you may have been on a path in your education that cuts out any type of data understanding, right? Then, so there's low data literacy, but there's also low storytelling literacy, right? So I think the assumption would be that it's much easier for a data scientist to learn storytelling than for a storyteller to learn data the way that they need to. And I would challenge that to say, storytelling is an art form that all designers must learn to get design in the world. Like, if you cannot convince somebody else that they have to have confidence in the recommendations that you're making, which is storytelling, then your designs kind of sit on a lovely shelf with awards, but never get to people, right? And that was something I figured out really quickly. And I think some people may think that it's so difficult to understand data science because they have this assumption that you have to be good at it or something. Like you have to know not only what an algorithm is, but how to build one, or you have to understand how to read large groups of data and all that good stuff. And so what I talk about is like this, even in our education systems, it's like you're either a creative, right? Or you're an engineer, right? We even have brains for it, right? Left brain, right brain. Like in our whole society, supposedly, in our whole culture, in our whole society, there's this artificial barrier between people who like numbers and people who like people or stories, right? And then those kind of artificial barriers that are culturally enforced, that are educationally forced, become organizationally enforced. So then when you go to start working, you have the researchers over here, and you have the engineers over here, or the statisticians over there, right? And so, like, organizationally, we have these silos of people who lean more towards stories versus people, or art, or creative versus numbers. And I think that's a false dichotomy, and I write about this a lot, which is why I use the term marriage when I'm talking about mixing research and data science, because marriage takes not only a commitment, but a falling in love of the other person's traits, right? So I talk about this transdisciplinary union that needs to happen. And so what that means is people who are the story creatives need to raise the data literacy bar enough that they can use their superpower, right, with storytelling, and match it with data and bring data in to help in what I call add jet fuel to their superpower. And then for the data scientists, they could find the most amazing cure or the most amazing function to change or create something. But without that storytelling ability, it's hard to get people to adopt it, right? So they have to take that really high, almost like abstract concept that they have in their brain and make a story out of it. And so why I call it a marriage is that a successful marriage isn't two people losing themselves to become a couple. It's two people who join themselves and are kind of like superpowered together to make a unit. And when you add design research and data or data science to that, it ups the game for both sides. It makes your research better, and it makes your concepts or your machine learning, all that stuff, much better.
Yeah, I mean, those who know me know that I do not shy away from a debate, but you will get no pushback from me on any of these points. I couldn't agree more. If you ask me, moving from a data scientist to a storytelling data scientist, so to speak, is much harder than moving from storyteller to data informed storyteller. I also think that, from my experience, it's much harder to find materials or get trained on storytelling than it is on data science principles, basics, statistics, math. And even as a child growing up, I feel like I was given much stronger foundations for what is now known as data science than I ever did for storytelling. And I was lucky.
That you ended up over.
I was lucky to have a lot of great inspirations when it comes to storytelling, a lot of great examples, finding different resources and putting them together just out of the curiosity, because it's something I value a lot. And I do think it's crucial.
I mean, as a journalist, like, I was literally writing 5 to 6 stories a day. Like, if you want to become a better storyteller, I mean, Malcolm Gladwell said this, right? Like, you just do it, right? And so I was able to codify what it took to write a really great story, right? Not just for my examination in literature, right? My degree is in communications, and I looked at literature and the great storytellers or whatever, but also just on a practical level. Like, what does it take to have a good story, to have people follow it, to have people at the end say whatever, right? And I think that kind of practice was very. I felt super blessed, but I didn't actually know that until later, right? I was just doing a job, right? I didn't really understand, like you said, I didn't understand the level of how important storytelling was going to be in this AI or design, a data design field, because you think it's just all numbers, right? And we're humans, and humans are wired for storytelling, right? And so I think that's why a lot of people think that it's just innate and you don't have to actually study it like you do something like statistics or data visualization or data science. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, to your point about, I think you were quoting Malcolm Gladwell there. So to his point, I suppose, of the best way to become a good storyteller is just to do it. If we can move to a bit more of the practical side,
for sure,
and address the storytellers in the crowd, the researchers who want to incorporate more data in these initial fuzzy phases of research. Where do you begin? What have you been up to at Microsoft or previously IDEO or other places? How do you do that?
So the first thing I talk about is raising your data literacy bar, right? And there's a place called the Data Literacy Organization. They do some really great work. But I'm just going to boil down to what I think every storyteller should start, and where I started all those years ago when I was doing computer assistant reporting. And the one thing that you could do to raise your data literacy, to raise the bar in your data literacy, is understand what I call the raw dough that data scientists or anybody who designs with data uses to create their masterpieces. And this could be like algorithms, equations, whatever. And that raw dough is understanding data in its raw form, and then understanding how that data is collected, how that data is stored, how that data is extracted, and then how that data is visualized to understand, right? So at a basic minimum, if you're a creative or designer out there, lynda.com has these classes, there are books you can do, whatever. I happened to learn it as an elective when I went to get my HCI degree at DePaul. Now I took this class. It was in computer science, and it was called data visualization. And I walked in, and everybody in the class were either data scientists or predictive analyst. And I was the only HCI major in the class. And I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be interesting. But I learned so much in that class because it was really about how I could just take, and I knew this too from being a journalist, but like data is always in a messy, raw form. There's no place on earth where data comes out in the way that we see it in algorithms and machine learning and all that kind of stuff. And this is why researchers really need to understand this, because everybody talks about AI and ethics and bias and all this kind of stuff. And they always talk about it after anything is made. But it's when data is collected, stored, and shared where people start making decisions about data and how it's shaped, that researchers can have the most impact ethically, right? And so if you don't really understand where people are getting data from, how that data is collected, and then what it means in its raw form versus in its shared form, like the difference, then it's really going to be very difficult for researchers to have any impact on the ethical use of this data.
And is the key? It does. And by the way, anyone who has begun to touch data, use data, one of the first things you always realize is how messy it is.
Yeah, it's totally messy.
And how organizing and cleaning the data is always a major step on the way to successfully understanding it. So what's the key to success there? Is it about collaboration?
Yeah, I think,
data scientists on your team?
Yeah, I think for me, I was doing it as a journalist. I learned how to do it. So I can literally go, I've used SPSS, I've used R, I can do what most data scientists do when it comes to data in this phase. Now, after that, I don't build algorithms or anything like that, but like I could go, you can say, hey, here's a bunch of data, and I can go and extract it. I've used Tableau, I've used, Power BI, like all these things, and I can make something make sense. So I can take, and this is the definition of design that Victor Papik said, I can take chaos and with intent, put order to it, right? And I think if you can't do that, or if that's something that you're not interested in, I think you definitely should just understand it, what's happening there enough to be able to do what I call intelligent interrogation. That means the person who is doing it, right? I think you should be with them and collaborate them and ask a bunch of questions and make them answer you so that you understand the data engineering, that's what I call it, the data engineering that this person wants to do with this raw data. So you're basically trying to figure out why this person is collecting this data, what this person is looking for in the data or expect to find in the data, and then a general sense of how the person wants to use the data to tell a story, because they want to tell something. And normally they have that hypothesis in their head. And so they go and they look for data that kind of matches that.
And so in your work today, are you kind of working concurrently to the data scientists, pulling data, and then kind of confronting them with some of the issues that you're seeing that maybe they aren't? Or how does that process
Yeah,
work
I think, well, ideally what I did at IDEO, which was to me the ideal way to do it, is that when I sat down to make my research plan, the data scientist was with me. So this is how being a computer assisted reporting and not seeing a difference between people and data impacts my research practices. So, you know, that list of questions you have for people, you know how you make it in your research plan and you're deciding who you want to talk to and what do you want to learn? Like those are the two questions. What do I want to learn and who do I want to learn from, right? Like those, at least that's how I start every research plan. And then because I work on multidisciplinary teams, those two questions are done in a group, in a collective way, right? So the engineer might want to learn one thing, the interaction designer may want to learn something else, whatever. We kind of like collectively decide that. The data scientist has to be part of that conversation to me, right? I treat the data scientist like a designer. They just design with algorithms. That's how I treat them. And so when I'm creating the research plan, we're creating it together. So once we decide what we want to learn and we decide who we want to learn from, then we create obviously ways that we want to learn, right? Sometimes it's concepts, boundary concepts at IDEO, that's what we called it. Sometimes it's interviews, whatever. But inevitably, it will be a list of what I call data as a stakeholder questions that play into the experience where data is input into a system or extracted from a system. So for example, service design. If I'm doing a service design project, I'm definitely going to talk to people who use the service, right? I'm definitely going to talk to people who don't, right? Because I want to see like why, right? People who are the target but don't use it. And I'm definitely going to say that everybody who uses the service, something is created in data from that, whether it's a phone call, whether it's a transaction, whether it's a whatever. So I want to talk to the person whose job it is either to store that, extract that, or visualize that, right? Because I want to talk to that person about gaps that person is seeing in the experience. And so it's like you have to look at it like a parallel paradigm, right? So there's what the people need, their motivations and why and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the behavior that ends up in the system. Because inevitably, I can tell you just by looking at an organization's, the way that they store their data, I can tell you how that organization is run. If their data is piecemeal and it's all over the place, then I can tell you that that's the way their organization is run. Because as people go, data goes, right? And the more streamlined an experience, the more streamlined the data. And so as a researcher, when I'm sitting around trying to improve an experience or working on a service experience, I have my people stuff, right? Like I have the people I need to talk to about the service, but every action has a reaction in data.
Yep.
And so I got to follow that too, right? If I want a complete picture, then otherwise, if I just talk to the people, I only have half the picture about why their experience is the way that it is. Because I need to know what kind of data they're generating, because then you can have another tool to help out in that experience, right? If we knew that people clicked instead of touched or whatever, then we'd have more confidence that we should probably have a click, whatever. You know what I'm saying? I'm just making that up. But so there's for every person's action, if you're talking about a system that collects that action, there's a reaction in data. And so I'm just trying to match the two to see if there's opportunities for design.
By the way, quick question about that.
Yeah.
In some cases, so I used to work for Airbnb, for example.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting place for many reasons, but one of them is that a lot of the experience with Airbnb is offline. It's
Yeah.
not it's not using the app and booking.
Mm-hmm.
It's checking into a house, it's staying there. Um, when you think of that type of experience and data, is data created? When or are there actually significant gaps in the data you have about people's behavior when
Well,
experience is offline, basically?
I think the key there is that the data isn't being collected. Because every time somebody checks into a house, if you put a sensor on that door, that's data.
Sure,
The only reason why you don't have that data is because it's not being collected, right?
sure,
And so for the data that you so that is the key point. Any data you have is data that's being purposely collected, right? And so it you have to put a fence around that, right? Because it only tells you the story that goes along with collection. But you also have to put a fence about what people say, right? Because unless you have a camera every time somebody checks in, you're just going on their word that they put their keys on the right hand, you know, in the foyer table, right? I always set my keys on the table. Okay. Then why does your wife tell me you can never find your keys, right? Like, it's not that the person is lying. It's just that they're
how
giving
did
you
you
a
know?
perception, right? Yeah,
How did you know?
yeah, right. And so I think that every piece, everything is data. What people are saying to you about their experience, that's data, right? It's just you're assessing that data based upon how it's collected. It's collected by memories. It's collected by storytelling. It's collected that to me that there's no like there's to me there. It's like cardinal sin versus venial sin. I don't know. I used to be a Catholic, where it's just like murder was this horrible sin, but like lying was this sin. Like I don't have that kind of judgment on data. So what somebody tells me is just as important as what I can see in their credit card transaction, right? The key is to match them to tell a better story. That's all I'm trying to say here. So you need to understand that whatever data you're getting from whatever source is incomplete.
So let's cover a bit more of storytelling with data. We have a question from Tiana, who, by the way, I believe has joined all of these conversations. I appreciate it. A loyal audience here. She asks, for when it comes to data, do you have any advice about the best practices for presenting data? What do you think are the do's and the don'ts? So you've talked about basic literacy, building basic literacy. You've talked about your collaboration with data scientists and building research plans together and so forth. There's also the component of actually sharing your research and presenting those data.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So any thoughts on that side of the equation?
Yeah, I think one of the things you learn when you take a beginning data science course or anything is how to visualize data, basically how to tell a story with it. Because nobody collects data just to sit in a storage bin. We collect data to tell stories. I'm just going to repeat that. We collect data to tell stories, right? It just so one of the first things you learn, just like you learn as a journalist, is to be honest in your storytelling, right? So if you tell me something and I'm going to write a story about it, then as a journalist, one of my jobs is to make sure that that is as accurate as possible, right? Same thing with data. If you are collecting data and you're telling a story with it, you have to be honest with it. So that means how you visualize it matters, right? So case in point, this is a true example. When I was a journalist, there would be these national polls out, right? And I'm sure people have heard of this. 75% of Americans believe, baseball is a national pastime, whatever. And I thought, whoa, that's a lot of Americans, right? Like, did they go talk to everybody? Like, blah. And it wasn't until I learned that a national survey that legally can say a percentage of Americans does X, has to have 2,000 people or more. That's it. So you can do a study on 2,000 people and then say whatever percentage of that 2,000 people equates to all of America. It's like representative statistics or whatever. And then when I took statistics, like, because people were using representative statistics, because it was obviously hard to talk to 300 million Americans, that there were a lot of people saying or attributing traits and behaviors and stuff to people based upon that national survey threshold, right? If you know about the national survey threshold, then that's accurate. If you don't, it's kind of like, are you telling me the truth, right? And I don't know how many times we've seen a meme that comes across our Facebook page that says 80% of all legal aliens are criminals or whatever. Like, you could see how quickly data can be distorted, right? Is it inaccurate to say that? Well, so I think one of the first rules of using data in storytelling is to be as accurate as possible and don't distort the data. So with data visualization, the way that the world map is, right? There's one version of the world map that makes Africa look really small compared to Europe, right? That's distortion of data, right? Because you're visualizing something that's out of proportion, that makes something that's in reality much bigger look smaller. So if you are going to start using data in storytelling, you have to make sure that you don't distort that data. So be honest. Google says this as well, be honest. That's one of the first things. The second is like provide context. Where did you get this data, right? I'm coming to this conclusion based upon blah, 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 blah. So you're explaining and giving context to say, this is not everybody in America. I surveyed 2,000 people, or my company did a survey of 30,000 college students, right? And we found that 40% of them, don't like their dorm room, whatever, or wouldn't use Airbnb, or would use Airbnb for whatever. Context is everything, right? Because when you distort data and you don't provide context, that's where bias shows up. Because people take that data and start making conclusions like causation, right? Like they start taking correlation and causation and they become all distorted and they mean the same thing. So you have to provide a lot of context. One of the things that data scientists would always do is talk about the limitations of their data. It's a really good practice. Instead of talking about all the things that their own can do, they talked about its limitations. The data scientists that I worked at, they were very clear about the limitations on the use of whatever machine learning product or service. And I think we all should start that way when we're talking about data, because it guards against us being people distorting our data, even without us there, or people not providing the context that it needs. Talking about the limitation of the data. So yeah, I only interviewed 50 people, but this is what they said. Or this is why in research you give a numbers game, right? You say we went to 5 cities, we interviewed 100 people, we blah, blah, blah. You're giving that context so that people understand the limitations of your data. I think those are the top 3. And I also think you need to understand about scale, right? How complex was the study? How complex was the factors or methods, the modality, like all of that, like what went into all of this visualization is very important. Was it just like a straight up online survey, or was there like, were there observations and tasks that people did and studies and diaries kept and all this kind of, like, how complex was the environment that this data came out of is really important too. So again, like, you wouldn't just slap up a bunch of quotes to people you never met, from people you never met, and try to convince your company to change design. You shouldn't just take a bunch of numbers and put them in a way that supports your hypothesis or not, without context and explaining complexity and being honest and not distorting. Same thing. Same thing with how you treat the research that you talk about. People consent, right? You get consent from people that you talk to. So you need to talk about that with your data. Like, did you get consent? Where was privacy? Like, how does that work? Like, all of that, like, that to me doesn't change. You have to be just as diligent when you're using data for your storytelling.
I wanted to ask you, in the realm of UX research, some companies take the approach when it comes to hiring of the generalist model. So they hire UX researchers or design researchers or product researchers, whatever they call it. Other companies, including some very large companies with the largest UX research teams in this country, maybe the world, hire quantitative UX researchers and qualitative UX researchers.
Yeah.
Given what we're talking about and the importance of data at all stages of research and to help address all problems, what do you think about that separation between qual UX researcher, quant UX researcher versus a generalist model? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I'm a generalist, and I've done deep ethnographic studies on futuristic technology to usability studies, large scale usability studies. Like, I've done the whole spectrum, and I understand the split, especially at a large level of an organization, especially like Microsoft. Like, I totally understand why Microsoft's has 50, 60 researchers who just do usability studies with, like, I work in business applications, right? And so we have, if you have 100 products, just to try to figure out, what you should build, what you should release, what you should change. Like, it makes total sense that you just have a posse of people that are talking to users all the time, documenting their behavior, coming back with some kind of like research to help you decide what kind of products to shelve, to keep, to blah, blah, blah. I mean, at that level, you need that, right? When I first came to Microsoft, I just couldn't believe that. I was like, what? That seems like but like, once I learned, I was like, my Lord, because like, if you have, like, at Microsoft, if we change a button, right? Like, that's 100 million people that's going to be affected by that. You need a lot of confidence. And again, this goes back to, what is research for? It is for confidence, right? It's not right or wrong. It's confidence. We're just moving the pendulum from I don't know to I feel more confident, right? And so you better make sure you're confident if you're going to take a product like Dynamics 365 and you're going to be like, we're going to move this arrow, right? You can't just do that in a vacuum. You have to have confidence in that. And statistically speaking, the way you build confidence is by talking to as many people as possible and making extrapolation about, that's usability. But I think as what I encourage folks who fall on the qual side, and this just comes from my experience with creating AI products and services that are fueled by artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. We are moving from an era where it's the device and myself, right? It's kind of like a one-way relationship. about how I interact with a product to very quickly to a multi-agency ecosystem of interactions. So it's me and my car and my car and my iPhone and my car and another car and my car and the camera on the street and my car and the pedestrian. And so like, it's not just me and my device. It's now we're in this ecosystem of interrelated interactions, right? And so when you start adding multi-agency to design, data is so important, because now you have to really pay attention, because it's dynamic now, right? You have to pay attention not only to how a product is made, but how it behaves. And the only way to really understand that on a scale is to have data, right? And so that's what I say to ethnographers. I said, you know, it's okay to want to be in qual, but if you really want to create human-centered products that are fueled by this dynamic technology that changes over time, right? Then we have to collect data. We need signals. We have to figure out how the thing is behaving over time, because it learns and it changes. So you're going from a very static design research era, innovation era, to a very dynamic multi-agency area. And so the more that you have in that ecosystem, the more that data helps you with confidence. At least that's how I see it.
I mean, yeah, Mindbloom, that is a fascinating topic. I think we could have a whole other discussion just on that. But my producer, which is me, is telling me we have to finish this up soon.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Holy
crazy.
Cow. Crazy.
Time flies when you're having fun. I know.
Yeah. Oh, we did. We had one question about somebody had done work on preschool expulsions. What was the age group corresponding to the data I was referring to? And it was high school.
Okay.
So the study I did was on high school students.
Is there anything else you wanted to kind of unpack first that was critical about data and design and research and how they all come together?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a new era of working. And I can only say that because I'm at one of the most futuristic places in the world right now. No doubt. Came from a really great, innovative place too. And I realized that this is going to sound really weird to a lot of people. I didn't realize that because I was in a bubble. But this idea, it's, as researchers, we have to become transdisciplinary if we're going to make high impact for the people that we're supposed to speak for. Users, people. I won't say users, but people. If we're going to be in the room to speak for people, then we have to understand all of these technologies and the way that they're made that will impact them. Just like we had to understand digital interaction design and all that good stuff, we have to understand how data plays into this new world that we are creating for ourselves. And so it's just imperative that we don't separate people from their data. And this is my last thing. What I had people create, I don't know if you were at my talk, but what I had you guys say over and over again, that all people create data and all data is created by people. And it's when we divorce people from data is where we get into trouble. As soon as we separate them, that's where all of our problems happen, right? And so if we just remember that as researchers, we've been so focused on people, right? We need to expand that focus to their data, right? Yeah. And it's our job to keep that together as long as possible. To be in a room with engineers and designers and product makers and say, let's not divorce people from their data.
I want to show you something. It's a bear. It's my notes app on my phone.
Yeah.
Check this out.
All day. Yeah. Yeah. I just,
boom.
That's amazing because like
it resonated. It
right,
resonated.
it resonated people because it sounds so simple, but it's a truism that we've forgotten, which allows us to create these silos and create these products in a way that divorces people from their data. And if we just remember that, it keeps us focused on keeping that together, right? If there's a data point, then there should be a person behind that. And if I just keep that in my head, then it just, man, it gets us out of all kinds of trouble. That's how we get into trouble.
I'm with you. We're here anyway, so let's take a final question here from Noah from LinkedIn UX Research. Thank you, Noah, for your question.
Oh, Noah, hey! I know him, so.
Do you want to have a little moment here?
Yeah, I know. I haven't seen him in a while, so giving him kisses.
So, hey, Noah, good to hear from you. So, do you have any actionable suggestions for breaking down silos between research and data science teams?
Yeah, I think, and I talked about this as my talk, but I think it's really important that we do that literacy bar, right? Like the more that researchers up their literacy, the more it's going to be easier for them to have conversations with people, you know, in the data science world. And then I think one of the things I talk about is establishing this trading zone. So establishing products where you are carving out space to work with a data scientist. What I've learned being at Microsoft is if you want to scale something, you have to do it in really small chunks. So nobody argues with a win, right? And so opportunistically, researchers or data scientists, doesn't really matter, should find projects that can showcase the marriage of these two in a way that they can storytell later about the win, like why each other needed to be there to make something happen. So you have to opportunistically do that, right? And I think for researchers, if they build more data, like one of the things I talk about is treating data as a stakeholder, right? So just like you treat, when you're doing your research plans, just like you treat like the people who use a product or the people who design a product or whatever, as stakeholders, treat data that way. Incorporate data into your research plans. And then it becomes like part of the process rather than something like separate. And then they have then the silos kind of just melt away because they're like, oh, okay, we need to bring in the data scientists and the researchers to go into the field together because this is just the practice of what we've created to create a better service. Because I know it works, right? I don't have to convince people that it works. I just have to show them how. And then once they see that, then it becomes part of the process, right? So as researchers, we need to bring more data scientists into the field. We need to incorporate data into our research plans. We need to make room for data to be added to the type of research that we're doing.
Yeah. Ovetta, with that, let's end. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. What should people reach out to you for, and what's the best way to do it?
Yeah. People reach out to me for all kinds of things. So things like this, because I love to teach and I love that kind of like flow. I also love learning. So exchange of ideas is like really great for me. Also kind of like mentorship. People kind of talk to me about my career, which I think is unusual. And I'm always up for that. And I'm an evangelist for human-centered design. So anybody who's creating a product and really want to understand how I have ready-made things to talk to them about. The best way to reach out to me is Ovetta at ovetta-samson.com or through my website, which is ovetta-samson.com. I have a submission form on there. So just reach out and I will help if I can.
That's awesome. And I will try not to be lazy and add that information to the show notes. Thank you everyone for watching, and everyone who will watch later on. If you want to talk
this was
about
great.
if anyone wants to talk about a topic that matters to them within the wonderful realm of UX research, I am all ears. That's my email, that's my Twitter. Get in touch and let's do this. Have a good night, everyone. Stay healthy and safe.
Yes,
and
please.
And thanks a bunch of Ovetta. We'll be in
Thanks
touch
so
soon, I
much.
hope.
This was great. Thanks for having me. Talk to you later.
Bye for now, everyone.